They thought he was done, washed up, out of sync. One poor qualifying session, and suddenly the narrative collapsed around him like a house of cards. But Lewis Hamilton didn't flinch. He never does. While the headlines screamed about pace and performance, Hamilton was reading something else entirely. A pattern buried not in the stopwatch, but in the data logs. Hungary 2025 wasn't a failure. It was a revelation. Because beneath the surface of another disappointing Saturday lay something far more dangerous, a fracture inside Ferrari. And it wasn't just technical, it was political. What Hamilton said in the pen afterward sounded benign to most. There's a lot going on in the background that's not ideal. But for those who understood the subtext, it was a coded message, a pressure release warning, a chess move made mid-match. And the first man to respond wasn't a strategist or a team principal. It was Ricardo Adami, Hamilton's race engineer. Publicly, Adami was handed to Lewis as a translator, a bridge into Ferrari's culture. But privately, those close to the team say he's become something else entirely. Not just a technician, but a conduit, a filter between Hamilton and a system that increasingly feels rigged. It started with FP3. On paper, it was uneventful. Both Ferraris completed their long runs, no red flags, no dramatic lap times. But when engineers reviewed the overnight data pool, something didn't add up. Hamilton had requested changes to rear ride height and diff preload, a subtle balance shift for braking confidence. Those changes were initially accepted, then quietly reversed. By the time he hit the track Saturday morning, the settings were gone. No explanation, no discussion. The changes were signed off by someone above Adami's level, reportedly from Ferrari's performance group, a shadow committee that oversees race weekend implementation. Leclerc's car, meanwhile, retained its exact Friday spec, optimized for rotation on corner entry, just as he liked it. 2 drivers, 2 directions. But only one philosophy allowed to persist. That's why Hamilton didn't sound frustrated after qualifying. He sounded betrayed. "I told them it wouldn't hold under braking." That radio clip wasn't broadcast live, but it was recorded. And inside the garage, engineers were already whispering. Not about lap time deltas, but about what had just been exposed, because the gap between the 2 drivers wasn't just down to balance or tyre prep. It was the result of a quiet override, a strategic decision that prioritised one car's setup philosophy over another, not based on data, but on politics. And in that moment, the Hungarian Grand Prix stopped being just a race. It became a power play, a battle not for points, but for control. Hamilton saw it. Adami saw it. And as Sunday approached, they both knew the real race had already begun, and it wasn't happening on track. To understand the magnitude of what happened in Hungary, you have to rewind, not just to the start of the season, but to the moment Lewis Hamilton signed with Ferrari. It was the deal that shocked the paddock. A 7-time world champion walking away from Mercedes, not for comfort or money, but for legacy. He wasn't chasing nostalgia, he was chasing transformation. Hamilton didn't come to Maranello to conform, he came to reshape it. But Ferrari, for all its beauty and brilliance, is not a team that adapts easily. Its internal structure is a mosaic of tradition, hierarchy, and quiet power centres. And somewhere within that mosaic, a decision was made. Charles Leclerc would be the fulcrum, the team's axis, the face of their future. That wasn't just a marketing call. It bled into strategy, engineering, and, as Hungary revealed, set-up philosophy. Coming into Budapest, Ferrari had 2 drivers on divergent trajectories. Leclerc, emboldened by back-to-back podiums and pole positions, was reasserting himself as the golden child. Hamilton, meanwhile, had been wrestling with a car that seemed to respond to his inputs with passive resistance, twitchy under braking, delayed on throttle, reluctant through direction changes. On the surface, it looked like adaptation issues. But insiders say Hamilton had already provided detailed feedback after every session since Silverstone, pinpointing exactly where the SF25 was destabilizing under high DG load transitions. The car didn't need redesigning, it needed adjusting, specifically in rear ride height, diff locking thresholds, and frontal aero balance under DRS loads. And yet, those requests were frequently delayed or denied. Sometimes due to protocol, sometimes under the guise of data-driven priorities. But when Leclerc's suggestions were implemented immediately, tyre blanket temp recalibrations, brake migration offsets, even cooling duct adjustments, the pattern became undeniable. Hungary was simply the first time it unfolded in broad daylight. Hamilton qualified 12th, Leclerc started on pole. But the delta wasn't talent, it was trust, or lack thereof. That's why Sunday morning's closed-door driver briefing became the inflection point. No media, no cameras, just engineers, strategists, and two drivers separated not by speed, but by political gravity. And that's when Hamilton did something no one expected. Calmly, without raising his voice, he looked across the table and asked the question that froze the room. Do you want two cars or just one? It wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't even a challenge. It was a referendum on Ferrari's values. A line drawn not in emotion, but in logic. Because in a championship this tight, when one driver is given full visibility and another is operating blindfolded, it's not just unfair, it's inefficient. And Hamilton, always the long game thinker, knew what he was doing. He wasn't starting a war, he was forcing a reckoning. Once the dust settled from qualifying, the focus shifted to the usual suspects: track evolution, tyre prep, and traffic interference. But deep inside the Ferrari garage, engineers knew better. The telemetry from FP3 through Q2 told a far more unsettling story. Hamilton wasn't slow, he was compensating. Sector traces showed he was braking earlier into turn 1, trailing off throttle longer into turn 4, and modulating mid-corner throttle at turn 11 in ways he hadn't done all weekend. This wasn't inconsistency, it was survival. The data showed clear instability under deceleration, particularly under heavy brake pressure at high-load corners. That's not driver error, that's chassis balance collapse. Specifically, a shift in rear ride height by approximately 2 millimeters, combined with a subtle change in differential preload. Two variables that completely redefined how the car rotated into and out of corners. On Friday night, Hamilton's camp had requested very specific adjustments. Rear ride height increase to stabilize the rear under braking. Diff preload lowered to ensure smoother transition out of apexes. These were not guesswork changes. They were based on degradation modelling and long-run telemetry from FP2. Adami, by all accounts, signed off on them. But by Saturday morning they were gone, reversed quietly, with no traceable override from Hamilton's side, and crucially, Leclerc's setup remained untouched. His car maintained the aggressive front-end rotation he preferred, supported by additional mid-corner stability through subtle front-wing adjustments. That's what Hamilton meant when he said, "I told them it wouldn't hold." Because from his side of the garage, it looked like sabotage. Not the dramatic kind, but the insidious kind, where performance is undermined through selective compliance. Even more damning was the brake trace data. Hamilton's pedal pressure profile looked erratic compared to Friday's runs, but it wasn't his inputs that had changed, it was the car's response. Engineers reviewing the braking curve saw a distinct pressure drop-off during the initial phase, followed by overcompensation mid-corner. That's a driver chasing confidence. And when Adami quietly requested a tweak to front brake migration for Sunday, a minor change under normal circumstances, he was told it violated the post-setup freeze protocol. Yet Leclerc's side had received approval for a thermal blanket recalibration at the same stage. Equal rules, unequal enforcement. These decisions may seem minor to the outside world, but inside an F1 team, where hundredths separate the front row from the midfield, they are everything. And for Hamilton, who built his career on feel, consistency, and the ability to adapt on the fly, the message was clear: adaptation alone wouldn't be enough. He was being asked to play chess with missing pieces. The only question now was whether he'd call it out or weaponize it. And as Sunday loomed, with P12 on the grid and no illusions about strategy parity, Hamilton began preparing not just for a race, but for something far more calculated. A long-form demonstration of everything Ferrari had failed to understand. Ferrari's race day strategy in Hungary looked routine on paper. Split the tyre compounds, protect track position for Leclerc, and run Hamilton long to open up options. But under the surface, the decisions revealed a team trying to manage more than just performance. They were managing perception. Leclerc's strategy was clean, predictable, and built around maximising his pole position start. He was given the preferred medium-hard sequence, with a first stint target window that gave him full access to undercut protection. Hamilton, meanwhile, was placed on the hard tyre for his opening stint, an aggressive call that left him vulnerable to early midfield chaos and with no meaningful cover in case of a safety car. At lap 18, when Hamilton reported rear degradation starting to spike, not unusual for the SF25 on the hard compound, his request for alternate stint parameters was delayed. Strategy engineers cited data volatility. Adami pushed back, suggesting a window close to lap 24. Instead, the pit wall delayed until lap 29. By then, Hamilton had lost more than 6 seconds in time delta relative to the midfield pack, much of which was unrecoverable. Leclerc, in contrast, was pitted proactively on lap 21, just before his degradation spike curve crossed the performance threshold. That alone didn't decide the race, but it revealed the pattern. Charles was being driven to the data model. Lewis was being asked to survive outside it. What's more telling is how decisions were communicated. Insiders say that while Leclerc received multiple Delta updates, lift and coast cues, and full sector gap overviews, Hamilton was often given broader pacing instructions without supporting data context. The request was denied, not explicitly, but through silence. Hamilton wasn't being misled, he was being starved of granularity. And yet, he never pushed back over the radio. No public complaints, no coded sarcasm, just quiet compliance. That silence was louder than any outburst. Because in Ferrari, protests draw attention. Silence draws suspicion. And Hamilton knows better than anyone. Suspicion inside an F1 team isn't just contagious, it's weaponizable. He didn't need to blow the plan up. He needed to let it play out. In Formula One, silence is never neutral. And in Hungary, the quiet tension between Lewis Hamilton and Ferrari's leadership had reached a kind of Cold War fragility. The race hadn't even begun, but the lines were already drawn, not by declarations, but by body language. Sunday morning in the closed-door strategy meeting, everyone felt it. Leclerc sat flanked by his longtime engineer and two performance analysts. Hamilton walked in with Adami and one junior data engineer. No smiles, no nods, just posture. And then came the question, delivered with surgical calm, straight from Hamilton to the room. Do you want two cars or just one? It wasn't just a philosophical jab, it was a direct accusation that Ferrari had made its choice, that parity wasn't real, and that Hamilton, a seven-time world champion, was no longer willing to pretend. Those in the room said the atmosphere froze. It wasn't raised voices, it was what didn't happen next. No one defended the structure, no one reassured him, no one said, "Of course we're backing both." The only movement came from Adami, who flipped the page of his race brief and looked down, silently acknowledging the truth. And from that moment, Hamilton stopped negotiating. He started listening, watching, taking mental notes. And what unfolded over the next 70 laps wasn't a rebellion, it was a test, not of strategy, but of character. Leclerc's race began smoothly. He held the lead, managed his tyres, and looked set for another podium. But by lap 43, everything started to unravel. His radio voice cracked. "Something's wrong with the car. Why am I losing time?" The response was clinical. Traffic, wind shift, tyre phase. But insiders now confirm what wasn't said. Leclerc had been sent out with a known chassis defect. Post-FP2 vibration metrics had shown a hairline anomaly in the left rear suspension point, small enough to clear inspection, but significant under thermal load. Ferrari gambled. They hoped clean air and track position would hide the imbalance. And for 42 laps it did. But under full stint stress, the problem surfaced. That's when something shifted in Adami. He didn't make a speech. He didn't challenge authority. But his behavior changed. Suddenly, Hamilton began receiving detailed, live feedback. Brake balance evolution, comparative lift points, even opponent degradation curves. Information that was typically filtered through layers of strategy suddenly came through clean. One word stood out: trust. Not in a tactical sense, in a human one. It wasn't rebellion. It was something far more dangerous in a hierarchical team like Ferrari: quiet realignment. From the outside, Hungary was just another blip on the championship radar. Leclerc finished 5th, Hamilton recovered to 7th. The point swing wasn't seismic, but to those paying attention, the Hungarian Grand Prix wasn't about numbers, it was about leverage. Because while Red Bull maintained their lead and McLaren capitalised with Piastri, the real story was what Ferrari lost: cohesion. And in a championship, this tight, internal stability is just as valuable as straight-line speed. Consider this. Had Hamilton been given the same setup continuity as Leclerc, simulations show he could have qualified as high as P5. That alone would have opened the door for a soft-medium split strategy, one that could have positioned him in the mix for P4 or higher, especially once Leclerc's chassis defect emerged. Instead, Ferrari walked away with 18 points, 8 fewer than their simulations predicted. Those 8 points could define the difference between 2nd and 4th in the Constructors' by season's end. Then there's the Drivers' Championship. Leclerc's early season lead has begun to taper under the pressure of McLaren's late surge and Verstappen's consistency. Hamilton, now sitting 6th in the standings, is too far to mount a title run this season, but that's not where his focus is anymore. Every race from this point on isn't about points, it's about influence. And Hungary just handed him something he didn't have before. Proof. Proof that the internal system has blind spots. Proof that his instincts were correct. And proof that he has an engineer willing to channel those instincts into action. Ferrari has always been more than just a racing team. It's a machine built on myth, legacy, and paradox. For every championship run, there's a shadow story of infighting, of power plays, of brilliance undercut by internal division. From Prost versus Mansell, to Irvine backing Schumacher, to the icy standoff between Vettel and Leclerc in 2019, Ferrari has never been a stranger to duality. The difference now is the scale of what's at stake. In Maranello, memory runs deep. The corridors of power remember 2007 when Kimi Raikkonen won the title, but only after McLaren imploded under the weight of its own internal politics. They remember 2010 when Fernando Alonso asked for strategic parity and instead got "Felipe, Fernando is faster than you." They remember 2017 and 2018 when Vettel looked like a champion until the technical structure fractured under pressure. That's why what happened in Hungary isn't just a 2025 problem. It's a reflection of everything Ferrari has wrestled with for the past 20 years. Because when a driver begins to question not just the decisions, but the architecture behind them, history shows two outcomes: revolution or rupture. The question now is, which path is Ferrari on? And then there's Ricardo Adami, a name that doesn't often feature in headlines, but within the team, he's earned a reputation as the man who protects racers. He did it with Vettel, he did it briefly at Toro Rosso, and now all signs suggest he's doing it again. But this time, the stakes are existential. Because if Adami becomes Hamilton's firewall, his protector, translator and conduit, he becomes more than an engineer. He becomes a threat to Ferrari's political hierarchy. For all the political turbulence inside Ferrari, there's one battlefield that ultimately defines the outcome: engineering. Because in Formula One, politics can bend a strategy sheet, but it's the car that decides the scoreboard. And right now, the SF25 is exposing a philosophical rift inside Maranello's technical heart. Hungary didn't just highlight setup bias or inconsistent implementation, it revealed a deeper problem. Ferrari is caught between two development doctrines, and their drivers are the embodiment of that split. The tension lies in the car's architecture. Internally, the SF25 was designed with a flexible platform, one that could support both rotation-focused and stability-focused setup paths. But in execution, the flexibility is collapsing under political pressure. Engineers have begun to default to the path of least resistance, Leclerc's feedback. Not because it's better, but because it's familiar. Hamilton's requests: brake migration flexibility, lower diff preload, increased damping on longitudinal compression, aren't speculative. They're data-backed, but implementing them requires not just hardware shifts, but software recalibration, and most critically, philosophical realignment. This is where Adami becomes more than an engineer. He becomes a system disruptor. Insiders say that after the Hungary debrief, Adami presented a secondary analysis to Ferrari's performance group, not through the traditional race report, but through raw comparative overlays. The analysis showed that Hamilton's ideal setup direction would have not only improved his own lap time by 0.38 seconds, but also stabilised Leclerc's balance over long stints. In short, a compromise existed, a middle ground, but it wasn't taken. In the cutthroat environment of the Formula One paddock, perception is performance. Every garage watches the others, not just for pace, but for cracks. And Hungary gave them a clear view into Ferrari's internal turbulence. At McLaren, engineers reportedly flagged Ferrari's asymmetric tyre phase-outs during Leclerc's stint and immediately speculated that something deeper was unravelling in the red garage. At Mercedes, a senior strategist was overheard in the media pen saying, "This feels like Vettel 2.0 all over again, except Lewis won't go quietly." But perhaps the most telling reaction came from Red Bull. Christian Horner, ever the paddock politician, was caught off camera smiling when asked whether Ferrari's internal structure was optimised for a two-driver push. His reply? Depends which two. These weren't just barbs, they were warnings. Because if Hamilton is truly engineering a shift from within, that kind of destabilisation affects more than just Ferrari. It opens opportunities for every other team on the grid. Mercedes, meanwhile, is in recovery mode. But Toto Wolff hasn't forgotten how to weaponise narrative. Privately, he's told stakeholders that Ferrari misunderstood the Hamilton investment. Publicly, he says little, but the plan is clear. If Hamilton's Ferrari chapter ends prematurely, through frustration or fracture, Mercedes would welcome him back for a final swan song with open arms. But the most nuanced reaction might come from within Leclerc's camp. While publicly unified, sources close to his side of the garage admit that Hungary introduced a new kind of pressure, one that's psychological, not mechanical. For the first time in years, Leclerc is the focal point of a Ferrari squad that doesn't feel unified. The chassis defect, the communication blackout, the soft unravelling of Adami's allegiance, all of it casts a shadow. Hungary was more than a fracture point. It was a rehearsal for the battles ahead. What unfolded at the Hungaroring is now echoing through every meeting, simulation session, and late-night debrief in Maranello. Ferrari's leadership can downplay the divide. They can call it driver-specific optimization or adaptive development timelines, but those inside the garage aren't buying it anymore. The next few rounds are where this quiet war will escalate. Zandvoort will expose car balance over extended mid-speed sweepers. And Monza, that's not a race, it's a referendum, a home Grand Prix that's already shaping up to be politically charged. If Ferrari continues to sideline Hamilton's feedback or delay implementation of his setup philosophy, the Tifosi won't need a press release to know something is off. But it's not just the upcoming circuits that matter. It's how Ferrari evolves, or refuses to evolve, its internal structure. Hamilton has proven in one race weekend that he doesn't need to win to seize control. Influence doesn't always show up on the leaderboard. It shows up in which requests are actioned, which engineers fall into step, and who carries the master telemetry file into the secondary debrief. Adami, by quietly backing Hamilton with real-time data and post-race transparency, has already redefined his role. He's not just an engineer now, he's a channel. And Ferrari's leadership knows it. The decision to segment the debrief after Hungary wasn't about time efficiency, it was an attempt at containment. But containment only works if the subject complies. And Hamilton? He's never been a compliant figure. Hungary may not define the 2025 championship, but it may come to define something even more significant: the next era of Ferrari itself. For all its historic prestige, Ferrari has long been a team burdened by tradition. It thrives on hierarchy, identity, and the romance of past glories. But in a sport increasingly driven by agility, data fluidity, and driver-engineer collaboration, that romance becomes rigidity. And Lewis Hamilton, whether intentionally or not, is forcing the Scuderia to confront that rigidity in real time. This isn't the kind of disruption Ferrari is used to. Previous internal struggles often revolved around personalities, clashes of ego, media blow-ups, or strategic implosions. But Hamilton's approach is different. It's methodical, data-backed, and grounded in performance logic. He's not asking for status, he's asking for structural equity. And that's more threatening than any media controversy, because it's harder to dismiss. The long-term implications are already surfacing. In Maranello, there are whispers that Hamilton has requested a re-evaluation of how setup decisions are prioritized within the technical chain, asking for parity not just in hardware, but in decision-making weight. That's not just a tweak, it's a culture change. If implemented, it would challenge the very idea of driver hierarchy at Ferrari, an idea that has historically dictated everything from aerofocus to pit stop order. Then there's the wider impact. Drivers across the grid, especially young ones watching from midfield teams, are noticing. They see Hamilton, at 40 years old, walking into one of the most rigid structures in motorsport and forcing it to answer for itself. That kind of cultural defiance, backed by performance acumen, reshapes how talent evaluates team moves in the future. Ferrari has always been obsessed with image. But Hungary revealed something that they hadn't prepared for: a driver willing to put performance above politics, and an engineer brave enough to follow him. The question for 2026 and beyond isn't whether Ferrari can build a fast car. It's whether they can build a team culture where honesty isn't punished and silence isn't policy. As the championship battle stretches towards Zandvoort, Monza, and the final flyaways, Hungary sits in the rearview mirror, technically behind, but still looming large. Because what happened at the Hungaroring wasn't just about one compromised setup, or one radio message buried by the broadcast feed. It was about a shift in the internal physics of Ferrari. Before Hungary, Lewis Hamilton was the outsider. Respected, sure, but still treated like a guest in someone else's house. After Hungary, he's something else entirely. Not a challenger, not a rebel, but a mirror. One that's forcing Ferrari to see itself without the fog of tradition. There's no formal power struggle happening in Maranello, no walkouts, no open defiance. But there doesn't need to be. This is Formula One. The real battles happen in data review sessions, in which setups get greenlit and which ones quietly get shelved. They happen in whose feedback is actioned on Tuesday simulator runs and whose is deferred until it's too late. They happen when an engineer, like Ricardo Adami, once assigned as a translator, becomes something far more powerful, a signal amplifier. From a pure points perspective, Ferrari is still in the hunt. They're within striking range in the constructors. Leclerc remains a podium threat nearly every weekend. But titles are won through alignment, not raw pace. And unless the structure realigns, unless they create a system that allows both cars to extract their full performance windows, they won't beat Red Bull. They won't hold off McLaren. Hamilton, for his part, is playing the long game. He's not storming out of meetings or demanding headlines. He's building a case, lap by lap, race by race. The shift is already happening. After Hungary, 2 junior engineers requested to be reassigned from Leclerc's data stream to a shared project under Adami's direction. That didn't make the press release. But in a team like Ferrari, it's as loud as a podium celebration. So what should fans watch for next? It won't be in the qualifying results or race finishes. Those will come later. Watch the radio calls. Watch the data overlays. Watch who gets the first setup updates on Friday mornings. Because Lewis Hamilton isn't just racing anymore. He's rewiring the team around him. And if Ferrari doesn't adapt fast, they won't just lose a title. They'll lose the one driver capable of redefining their future.